A very warm welcome to all of you joining us today on yet another edition of the Spotlight. Now today we have an exclusive interview with the Secretary General of the Commonwealth Local Government Forum, Ms. Lucy Slack, joining us today here in the ITN studios and joining us here in Sri Lanka as well on an official visit, I would say. So thank you for joining us today to have this exclusive discussion here with us.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you.
So how are you doing today?
Very well, thank you. Very well.
So you are here in Sri Lanka visiting for an important conference, I believe. So let's talk about this conference. I'm not going to give an insight to it. I think our viewers would like to hear it from your perspective. What is this conference all about?
Well, maybe if I just take it back a slight step and just to say that the Commonwealth Local Government Forum is a Commonwealth organisation that brings together local government representatives and ministries of local governments from across the 56 member states of the Commonwealth. So we're quite a sizable network of stakeholders involved in local government, in local development and local democracy. And obviously one of the key priorities for us is around equity in political leadership. And so one of the things that we're here to do this week is to run jointly with the Federation of Sri Lankan Local Government Authorities a conference on women's political empowerment in this particular region in South Asia. So we'll have a delegation of colleagues obviously from South Africa, Sri Lanka, who are working on, who are interested in engaging and being part of the sort of local political process. But we'll also be bringing in participants and practitioners from around the different countries in the South Asia region. So Bangladesh, Maldives, India, Pakistan, and also a small delegation from Nepal. Outside the Commonwealth formally, but obviously a strong partner in the region with a lot of good experience to share. And what we're going to be doing at the meeting is we're going to be looking at how the steps that we can take to try to encourage more women into political leadership, looking at some of the barriers that affect women coming into leadership. And then we're going to be agreeing, we hope, a small charter for gender equality in the region to build on the work that's already been done and to get more, if you like, local government practitioner buy-in into some of the changes and things that might help engage more women into politics at the local level.
So now what inspired the theme of reinforcing social resilience through women's political representation for this conference?
I think when we think about local government, we have to think about how close it is to all of the daily things that affect our lives. You can almost say that you're born and you die and local government follows you through that whole period. So, you know, as the form of government that's closest to local people, it plays a really important role in our lives, whether that's around how our cities or our communities are planned, whether that's around how our waste is delivered or how our waste is managed, how our water arrives in standpipes or in our homes. There's lots of those services, but also social services that local government is responsible for. And I think increasingly as we see the impacts of some of the wider sort of global challenges, like of course the climate emergency, but also some of the sort of economic problems and challenges that our communities are facing, local government is increasingly important in terms of the services and those basic services that it provides. So I think what we wanted to do with this event was build on our own work as an organisation around the role of local government in building resilient communities, in responding to some of those challenges, and thinking particularly about the role of women in that, and also how we need to make sure that local government is providing equal opportunities for all genders so that everybody has the kind of access to the kinds of services that they need at the local level.
Now the Gender Charter, which has been developed by the Commonwealth Local Government Forum, this charter, this gender charter that we talk about, how does it support and promote women's empowerment in local governments?
I think with the Gender Charter, what we've been trying to do is to recognise that there's been a lot of progress in the South Asia region in terms of gender equality. Many of the countries in this region have quotas, so in terms of the numbers of women in local leadership, it's relatively high if you look across the whole of the Commonwealth. which is great and really, I think, has made a huge difference in this part of the world. But I think when we talk about gender, of course, it has to be about more than just the numbers of people that we have around the table. It also has to be around the impact of the way in which women who are around the table are able to influence decision making at the local level. So the idea of the Charter is really to try and pull together everything that we kind of know about gender in this region, to sort of consolidate it into one document, so highlighting a bit some of the challenges, some of the progress that's been made to date, and then think about some of the areas where it's important for us to look towards driving change. So we've looked, for example, at, I'm going to put my glasses on because I'm going to cheat sheet slightly on this just to make sure I don't forget anything. So we've looked particularly about urban and local planning and how we can engage women into the planning, but also how we can make sure that cities are planned to make them more equal, so that, you know, women, for example, making sure that our markets are well lit, so that, you know, there's a security for women who are working in markets. Thinking about access and open access in terms of the sort of urban infrastructure, for example, and provision of basic services at the local level, and making sure that those services are accessible both to all genders. We've looked a lot around how we can sort of use some of the lessons that we've learnt to sort of change a little bit the perceptions around women in leadership, to look at promoting greater awareness of the importance of women in leadership, looking at how we can champion good practice in women's leadership, challenging some of those social norms that we all know affect women in going into politics particularly. And then we've also tried to look a little bit at economic empowerment, because of course if you're not economically empowered, it's also very difficult for you to engage in local politics. So that kind of dimension is of course hugely important, and the role of local government in providing that enabling environment for economic development is of course very powerful and very important as well. We touch on ending violence against women, a crucial issue in across the Commonwealth, and definitely one of the priorities for the Commonwealth Secretariat, the sort of intergovernmental part of the Commonwealth, and many of the organisations like CLGF working at the implementation end. And of course climate change, disaster risk reduction and relief, because local government is the first responder in these situations. And we know that climate change is disproportionately affecting women. So we've looked at those different sort of sectoral aspects and those areas where local government sort of intersects with the lives of local communities and women in particular. And then we've looked towards trying to sort of set out some commitments that we hope during the meeting our members who are present and our partners who are at the meeting will endorse, we hope add to and strengthen. Because what we would quite like to do when we leave is to go away with some clear commitments that local government wants to drive at the national level. This needs to be something very much responding to what's happening in the local context, and we know that there's a lot of shared contextual issues in South Asia, but also a lot of things that are very country specific, even state specific. So what we want is a document, a tool that our members can use to promote gender equality in their own work, but also look at how accountable they're also being in terms of change at the regional level.
So now, from the perspective, there are the member countries in the Commonwealth that we see. In your area of expertise, and also as Secretary General of the Commonwealth of Local Government Forum, let's take Sri Lanka. What do you think? Where do you think we stand in terms of women's representation? Are we doing good?
I think Sri Lanka is an interesting case. I think Sri Lanka was relatively low in Commonwealth terms, and then of course the implementation of the quota of 25% women at the local level, I think made a huge difference. And I think, we all know that it really helps if you're a young woman thinking about going into politics. If you already see women in local politics, it feels more accessible. So I think that's hugely important, and I think will have a very strong impact in terms of the next elections and seeing more women coming into politics.
Yes, because in Sri Lanka it's a common norm, especially in the Asian countries. They tend to say that women are very emotionally driven, and sometimes they question decisions that are made by women. They think these decisions made from the heart rather than from the mind. What would you have to say?
I think those decisions are taken from the knowledge and the experience that those women bring to the table. And personally, I think it's good for all of us that we have more women around the table, that we have a more equal representation of gender, of age, of ethnicity, of religious background around the decision-making table at the local level, because everyone brings a different perspective of their city or their local government or their community. And I think if we can bring those decision makers around the table, our decisions will end up being, I think, better for the whole community.
Now, from the South Asian region, Lucy,
Yes.
let's talk about some of the key challenges that we encounter, and what is the forum going to do about these issues? What are you all going to do to address these issues?
I think one of the things that we're going to do at this meeting over the course of the next couple of days is obviously bring some of those challenges together, understand and see which are the shared challenges, maybe where some of those challenges are country-specific, context-specific. I think you can never underestimate the value of coming together as practitioners. So we'll have a group of practitioners who are already councillors or aspiring councillors or are working with leaders across the Commonwealth to exchange experience. And that's going to be the first thing that we're going to do. And I think it's important to kind of differentiate between what we can do as an organisation and what our members and our partners can do on a day-to-day basis on the ground. For us, obviously, the Charter is a major contribution, providing a kind of platform and an enabling environment for women to come together. CLGF has also set up Women in Local Government Network. So we'll have the chair of our Women in Local Government Network with us at the meeting. She's actually a councillor from Grand Bahama in the Caribbean. So she will bring a very different perspective herself, but will be very keen to look at where CLGF can respond to the needs coming up at the meetings that we're going to be having this week. We are working already on some very practical tools, which are digital online tools, open access for women who are interested in engaging in political leadership at the local level in South Asia. So we've been working on those in India and in Bangladesh. We've had some engagement as well with colleagues here at FSLGA in terms of using those tools in some of the work that FSLGA has been doing. And of course, you'll know that the FSLGA has quite a significant project which it's delivering in partnership with the Government of Canada on women's political empowerment and women in local leadership. So, what we're doing is bringing some of these ideas together, and what we expect to come from the meeting will be a set of recommendations that we can then also respond to.
So let me just briefly ask you, in this conference which will be taking place in Sri Lanka, who are the key figures who will be attending this conference, especially from the government of Sri Lanka?
We'll be having an official opening of the Women in Local Government meeting, and we're very honoured that the Prime Minister is planning to attend that meeting. As I've mentioned, the Ministry and FSLGA are both members of CLGF, so it's really great for us to be here in Sri Lanka to deliver this event. But our primary stakeholders will be local government leaders. Local government decision makers, some experts from around the region who work on women's political empowerment at the local level from various think tank organisations, membership organisations, and we also have a small staff team with us as well who will be, if you like, the continuity and the link in terms of taking the recommendations that have come from the meeting and making sure that we respond to them as an organisation.
So the Honourable Prime Minister of Sri Lanka will also be attending.
He will be
conference,
attending, yes,
right?
the opening, yes.
Okay, so moving on to another question, Lucy, let's talk about some of the key challenges faced in the South Asian region. We spoke about that as well, but I want to ask you now, especially young women trying to enter politics. There seems to be a question there. You know, sometimes women think, is this the right path for me? Is this relevant to me? Is it accessible to me? I think I'm coming down to the term accessibility, and how can we make local governments more accessible for the young women trying to enter the scene?
I mean, I think this is a big challenge, not just in this region. I think this is something that we see across many countries in the Commonwealth. And I think there are a number of sort of steps that we can take. I think the first is, of course, awareness around standing to be a councillor, and the PM I Will is a really good example of a project that's really working hard to promote that, to raise awareness across with young women about the opportunities of standing for local government. And I think there's a couple of things sort of within that. I think the first is sometimes people are not necessarily always aware about what local government does. You know, we often don't necessarily always associate where our services come from, who is the decision maker for that. And, you know, even in Sri Lanka, you know, you have a relatively complex system in terms of services being provided by different levels of government. And sometimes it's not always clear exactly what the role of a councillor is. So it's really important that we promote that and that we raise awareness in places where young women will be, whether that's in the university or whether that's in community groups and organisations, that we're looking for young women who really want to lead in their local communities. I think that's the first thing. I think we also need to think a little bit about some of the systemic barriers that impact on local government and on women coming into leadership. Obviously, in many countries, political parties are very important gatekeepers in terms of who gets onto, whether it's the list or whether they get elected to be kind of political nominees to run for council. And I think we need to look at working with political parties on that issue. It's very, very important. They play a really key role. I think there's a lot of issues that we need to address, and I'm not saying we're going to be able to address all of these at the event, but we'll definitely touch on them. The issue of funding, and those are very real, very live issues in terms of running a campaign. And then I think one of the other things to really make sure is that particularly maybe young women who haven't been so involved in local government actually have the chance to understand a little bit more, not just about what local government does, but what their role will be once they're elected as a councillor. Because I think when you go into local government as a new councillor, it doesn't matter whether you're male or female, it's a new environment, and it's really important to know a little bit about how things work, what is going to be expected of you, because we want to see those young women coming into decision-making positions. We want them obviously to be on council, but we also want to see them as chairs of committees, as chairs of finance committees, in the sort of decision-making processes, and as mayors and leaders, of course.
Of course. Now, more often also, we always talk about what more can we do, we're not doing enough. It's always around those lines of conversation that we talk any topic, whether it's politics or economics, anything in that for that matter. I would like to ask you, there will obviously be some successful international cases where there is inclusion in the Commonwealth, especially from the Commonwealth, that highlight a successful political, social, where it is including all female representation. Would you have any examples or international cases that we could talk about?
I mean, there are some really good examples around the Commonwealth of different sort of ways in which countries have looked at including and supporting more women into leadership. A number of countries where you have proportional representation, where they have a system where if you have one man on the list, the next person is a woman on the list, which helps to increase the numbers in leadership. We see a lot of countries where they're looking at networks as a way of supporting women in leadership, so bringing together peers to actually support each other, but also to do some of that advocacy in the interim between elections to sort of say, you know, come on, this is a really great opportunity for women. I think, you know, women, obviously women supporting women, but also having male champions in local government associations, political parties that recognise and articulate the importance of having more women in leadership. And I think, you know, the challenge is, of course, retaining those numbers. You know, you might see women elected, but then, you know, do you see them replaced if they move on and that kind of thing? So, you know, there's a lot of challenges that we face. It's not something I would say that any one country has particularly nailed. It's something I think we all need to do better on. And I think, you know, events like this, networks like our Women in Local Government network, things like mentoring, for example. There's some really great examples of mentoring programs in different parts of the Commonwealth, sometimes formal, sometimes informal, which have really, I think, helped support women in leadership. So there are lots of examples, and I'm sure that we will hear more about that over the course of the next 2 days. And
but
maybe
the fact
one
that
of
there are countries trying to do their best and implement is a great step forward. So we're hoping that, you know, many other countries will follow and make way, because that is what we need. At least baby steps is what we say. You know, you can't make an ocean by a day.
No.
It takes drops. But progress is what matters, positive progress. And I want to ask you, let's talk about some of the ongoing projects done by the Commonwealth that aim to increase women's representation. And have there been any outcomes so far?
Yeah, we've been doing a number of different kinds of activities to support our members around gender equality in local government, around political leadership and women's political leadership in the Commonwealth. We've been doing some work, for example, in Southern Africa, particularly looking at the value of networking women already in leadership, but also women who are interested in engaging in political leadership, and looking at how doing that can help sort of provide a kind of supportive environment for women who are standing for election. I would say it's sometimes quite difficult to move that dial, but we have had some success in terms of increasing participation in the successful election of women. It is something which we have to really sort of maintain a focus on. And I think probably it's worth saying it's really important that this is not something which we should be focusing on just at election time. As you can imagine, you need to really invest in time, energy and effort in that period between election. As I mentioned, we've been doing some work in this part of the world around digital training tools, modules. On Thursday of this week, we'll be running social media training, looking at how women can use social media in their both in their campaigning, but also in their support and their engagement with their constituencies. And we've also been doing some work around women's access to local economic development opportunities. You know, I talked about that intersection between local economic development, economic empowerment and women's political empowerment. And I think that's an area, possibly a little bit of an underexplored area, particularly in South Asia, where, you know, there are tools at the local level to create that kind of enabling environment for local economic development, and looking at how we can do that in support of women.
All right, Lucy, we had to head into our first break this evening, and you know, after the break we will be talking more about the Federation of the Sri Lankan Local Government Authorities, where women enter politics. So let's hear more about it right after this break. All right, welcome back to the show, and we are in conversation with Lucy Slack today to talk about all things regarding the local government scene here in Sri Lanka and regarding the Commonwealth as well. So the Federation of Sri Lankan Local Government Authority, a very long name, and I'm sure there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes as well. Now, they are also actively empowering women in politics. But it's quite ironic, Lucy, because in Sri Lankan politics, the representation of women is even countable on your 10 fingers today. So, I mean, it's something that we need to address strongly. and we need women in politics because that is where the decision process for the country is taken. So how would you address this? How is the Federation, you're also actively working with the Federation, especially these past few days in relation to the conference which is taking place. What is the progress you are seeing with women in politics in Sri Lanka?
Well, I mean, I think obviously, at the moment there is no political leadership in local government in Sri Lanka. I think that's probably the first thing to just note. But of course, it's really important that when the next local government elections do come around, that women are ready and they're prepared and they're able to kind of come into the sort of democratic process. So FSLGA is a local government association, so it represents all of the local governments in Sri Lanka, or most of the local governments in Sri Lanka. So it has a really strong role here, I think, as a kind of collective voice for local governments. Many countries in the Commonwealth have an equivalent organisation to the FSLGA, and many of those organisations also focus on their work to sort of support gender equality in their respective countries. I'm not familiar with exactly everything that the project has been doing, but I know that the project has been doing a lot of work to really train young women in particular to understand what local government does, to understand what their role would be as a councillor, and to think about planning and preparing their campaign for political leadership at the local government level. So really understanding the process in terms of getting into local government, but also what happens when you are elected, which I think is critically important, and some of those kind of support networks that exist in Sri Lanka for women in leadership.
Now, these training programs that are offered by the Federation of Sri Lankan Local Government Authorities, how do these programs, how do these equip women with more knowledge and skills to enter into the political arena of Sri Lanka?
I mean, I think I would say that they're incredibly participatory, they're incredibly practical, and I think that one of the things that they've really focused on is giving women tools. So giving them the resources to be able to make a difference once they are elected. So it's not just a case of going to a meeting and listening to somebody talking. It's actually things like role play, it's actually things like practical materials that they can take away from those events to actually support them in their campaign and in their work. And I think that's really critical because, it's very easy to talk about these things. But sometimes it's actually really helpful to engage with someone who has maybe already been a councillor or has a much better understanding than you of actually what to expect, because it can be quite daunting. It's new, it's something maybe that you haven't been familiar with before. So as much knowledge, capacity that you can have going in with your eyes wide open, it's going to make you much better and much more responsive in terms of the demands on your role as a new councillor.
Yes, but question that I always have in mind, trying to get women into not just politics. I mean, in the business arena in Sri Lanka, we see a lot of women taking on lead roles, being CEOs, business women, and all, going into all of that. But when it comes to politics and the local government arena, Lucy, for some odd reason at one point it just stops. Is it because women are scared? Is it because they feel that their value is not really recognized enough? This thing that we have been doing has been going on for years, I believe. It's not something that we have been working towards only, for the past week or so. All since history, we are always trying to get women into power. But for some odd reason, a reason that I will never ever understand is we just don't make the cut sometimes. Why do you think that is?
I think there's a few reasons, and I'm not saying that this is an exhaustive list. I do think society sometimes marginalises women, particularly, there are some real challenges that women face in this part of the world. And I think one of the things we need to think about when we're thinking about women going into politics is also thinking about women's families supporting them into politics. We talk a lot about political parties, they play a crucially important role, absolutely. We talk a lot about society and how we do things differently to enable women's political participation. Childcare is a really good example of that, but also things like the timing of meetings, when council meetings take place. But I also think that there's a very important role in terms of women's families in supporting them into politics in this part of the world. And I think there's a very important role for existing political leaders in encouraging more women into political leadership, because as I said right at the beginning of this discussion, actually councils are better, local governments are better when they have a much broader representation, because they're much more representative then of the communities that they're serving. And we want those kind of local governments. We want those kind of local governments that can think about, this is maybe what women, children, older people require, because we want to be taking those decisions in the round, and that will make the decisions that the council takes stronger. And I also think that things like the quota system that you've just introduced here, it's relatively early days, will make a big difference, because
yes,
I think
25%.
increasingly women, young women particularly, will see women in decision making, and they'll think, actually I could do that. And I think that is a crucially important step.
The quota is 25%, I believe. Now, the
yeah.
collaboration between the Federation and other various organizations coming into play, how do you think these help female council members meet this quota of 25% in local government or for women's representation?
I mean, obviously I don't work for FSLGA, so I don't want to kind of speak out of turn here.
But how do you think, especially with the Commonwealth playing its role, how do you think that collaboration works?
I mean, I think our job, and I would say CLGF's job, but also the Federation's job, is really about continuing to really profile some of the good practice, some of the real positive achievements that women are making. I think that's very important. I think it's really important for us to be motivated by what's happening at the local level, to hear the voices of women. I mean, one of the things that my organisation is really trying to do is look at how we can get more women into our board leadership, which is actually, at the moment, we're very heavily male dominated, because, the same applies for an international organisation like ours. You take better decisions when you're more representative. So we are working on it ourselves. It's not something that we've also achieved. And I think the key for all of us is to keep this issue in the public domain. I think one quite interesting development of the last kind of 10 years is, many of you all know about the Sustainable Development Goals. So the goals that globally we've all signed up to in terms of economic, social and environmental development. So the SDGs, exactly. One of the SDGs, SDG 5, is around gender equality. And within that, of course, we hear people quoting a lot the number of women in parliament. But within the SDG 5, so SDG 5.5.1b, is actually women in local government. So actually increasingly, it's being recognised how important it is for us to have women in local government, and those figures are being recorded. So I think, that is also a sign globally of how we recognise the importance of women in local leadership.
Now, how do you envision the role of women in local government evolving in the coming years in South Asia?
Well, my vision for local government and for women in local government is that we meet the target of parity, and that it doesn't become a subject that we have to talk about. You might remember, after the Canadian elections, when Justin Trudeau was first elected, and he had a cabinet that was equal representation of men and women. When he was asked the question about this, he said, that's not really an issue. We shouldn't really be talking about that, because it should be something that we expect. And I think you can clearly see that a lot of effort is being made towards gender equality. We know we have a way to go, but I think that the ground is set fair. And I think it's up to organisations like us to make sure that we empower women to take on those positions.
Now, how can local governments, all these, the past few minutes we have been talking about how women can come forward, that they should take that step. But I would like to ask you in a different sense, how would you advise local governments to create an environment, to foster an environment that is comfortable, where women are sort of free to come in, that they are comfortable to come in? How would you advise local governments to move through this narrative?
I think there are lots of things that local governments can do to be more welcoming and to be more inclusive. I think, there's obvious ones like how you time your meetings so that women can be there. I mean, simple, very practical steps. I think there are, issues around committees and making sure that women can be involved in not just as representatives of council, but in some of those smaller decision-making committees, particularly where some of the bigger decisions are often made. I think we all need to be very able to let everybody have their say around the table. I think it's important that we respect each other as politicians. I think there's quite a lot of codes of conduct around good practice in meetings, and I think that's very important, particularly for women, but for everybody around the table in terms of local government. So I think there are very practical steps. I think we really benefit from having male champions who really support gender equality, that put their, that sort of actively speak in favour of gender equality in local government. And then, of course, behind the scenes, the work that organisations like FSLGA undertakes as organisations to kind of really support that national level policy, to really keep awareness of what's happening in local government, how many women are in local government, what kind of role are they playing, is hugely important.
Now, if someone asks you, Lucy, what
Yes.
are the potential benefits of having a gender diverse, all-inclusive, gender-balanced representation in local government bodies, what would be your answer?
I think that we make better decisions if we're more representative. I think gender equality is something which means that when decisions at the local level are taken, you have representation of everyone around the table, which means that you can take into account the views of a cross-section of people in the community. In fact, many of the services that local government provides, often they're seen as services where the primary users are women. And so it's really important to hear those voices when making those decisions, where water standpipes are going to be located, how different services are going to be provided, some of the social services that local government provides.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important that it's not just a domain of one gender over the other. I think it will be better if we work together.
How can women in local government serve as role models and mentors for the future generations and the young ladies stepping into the scene?
One of the things we're going to be doing this time is this training, as I mentioned, on social media. And I think one of the important ways of doing that is really to increase the profile of women in leadership. Often women in leadership come very much from a kind of community background. Many of them have been very strong community advocates. They've been working very closely with their local communities for a long time. So they have a really good kind of community network and people know them in their community. But thinking about how can we get that message wider in the country is, I think, one really important role. So organisations like yourselves here, the media, really how can we use the media to kind of positively profile some of the things that women are able to achieve in their local authorities. Also, organisations like FSLGA, how can FSLGA actually look at supporting its women members, profiling the work that they're doing, and continuing to call for change, because this is not going to be something we know that happens really quickly. We're not going to have done this and ticked it off in a week's time. So this is almost like a campaign that we really need to keep moving, and we really need to keep refreshing.
Well, what are the expectations of Sri Lankan media from the Commonwealth?
I think we mustn't underestimate the power that the media has in terms of politics. And I think in terms of providing kind of a fair assessment of what's happening in politics is really important, giving voice to different stakeholders from within the political process is crucially important. You could, for example, see channels like this saying, we're going to look at having gender balance in terms of the people that we interview, or because we really need to keep those people in the public eye. We need to keep those local leaders in the public eye so that people can see what they're doing on behalf of local communities.
Now, how are you all planning to include technology and leveraging technology into your future programs, future training sessions, especially with the conference taking place in Sri Lanka? What are your outcomes that you're expecting?
I think one of the things about technology is that since the COVID pandemic particularly, I think it has become something that we're all a bit more familiar with. But I think we have to remember that a lot of people still don't necessarily have equal access in terms of technology. So for us, we're very mindful of the need to look at different ways in which we support different communities. But I think technology is increasingly going to be something that we use to benefit and to support women in leadership. So we're talking a lot whilst we're here around social media as something which is a really important route into sort of strengthening campaigns, to profiling what women councillors are standing for example. But also, as I mentioned, some of our digital training tools, thinking about how we can make information training as accessible to as broad a number of stakeholders in the region is really, really important to us. And I think, going away from the meeting, I think a couple of things. One, we really hope that our members and partners who come to the meeting will embrace the Charter, will want to sign up to the Charter, and will want to measure some of their progress in terms of gender equality against the Charter, because I think it would be great for us to sort of track that progress, to know what is happening, and to look at where the gaps are. I think a second area for us is looking at where we could maybe do more in terms of supporting our members. Maybe that might be in terms of practical programs and projects. So we're definitely looking at conversations around that. And then I think the third thing for us is that as a Commonwealth organisation, one of the things that we try to do is raise some of the issues that relate to local government with heads of government when they meet. So you might be aware Commonwealth heads of government meet every 2 years. The last CHOGM was hosted once in Sri Lanka, I think back in 2013, so you have very practical experience of that in Sri Lanka. You know what a CHOGM feels like and looks like. But that meeting happens every 2 years. There's a CHOGM in October of this year, in 2024. And one of the relatively new innovations of CHOGM, so since the CHOGM was hosted in Sri Lanka, is something called the Commonwealth Women's Forum. And this is an opportunity to bring together some heads, but also women ministers, ministers of women's affairs, I should say, not women ministers, to look at kind of policy that the Commonwealth can push. And gender equality is a really important part of that. So one of the things that we've already done is we've shared our statistics around women's representation in the Commonwealth, and we are going to be sort of participating, helping to organise the Women's Forum, and helping to make sure that we also recognise that political leadership is more than just what happens at presidential and parliamentary level. It's also crucially important at the local level, and it's really important that we empower women in terms of local government.
What are the long-term goals and plans that you all have in mind for, the foreseeable future?
As an organisation, we focus on both the sort of democratic mandate of local government, so the voice, the representation, and also on the sort of practical service delivery function that local government has. And I think for us, obviously what we're looking for in terms of gender equality is parity. This is something that we're working towards. It's a process. It's not something that will happen immediately. And I think what we're looking for really is local government that really helps to kind of like reinforce that sort of to reinforce sustainable development in line with the sustainable development goals that we've already mentioned, but really safe, resilient, inclusive local communities that work for all.
All right, as time is ticking, what is your take-home message to all of us watching us today?
I think my take-home message is let's look to see more women in local leadership, and let's make sure that we vote for them when they're on the ballot paper.
Brilliant. Do we hope to see you one day? Hopefully.
Who knows? I doubt it.
All right, thank you so much for joining us today, and wishing you and the team nothing but the best.
Thank you very much. It's been great to join you.
So we were in conversation with the Secretary General of the Commonwealth Local Government Forum, Lucy Slack, right here at the ITN studios. And that brings us to the end of yet another edition. Join us again next week for a story that will ignite change. Until we meet again, stay safe.